Hello everyone and welcome to video number 7. In this video we're going to be talking about one of the key pieces of Python programming called variables. This is something we talked about in class, so if you saw us in class then this might be a review, but we might talk about a few new things in this video, so it might be worth watching. Today we want to talk about a few things. What is a variable? How does it work in computers? Like what's happening in the background? We want to talk about how to make variables, and we want to talk about all the rules for naming variables appropriately. So those are the 3 topics that we covered in this video. First, what is a variable? So if you have heard this word before in math, then it's actually going to be very similar. But the biggest difference is that a variable, although it can hold any value, we are actually taking that value and storing it in memory when we make a variable in programming. So if we want to make a definition, we should include both of those things. So a variable holds a value and stores that value in memory. In the last video, we talked about data types. So we can have lots of different kinds of values, and all of those different data types are stored in memory whenever we make them. Now, when we are programming within a script, most of the time we are working in something called a virtual environment. Let's write that down. The virtual environment. This is sometimes abbreviated VENV. And when you make a new project, sometimes you'll see a folder that says virtual environment. I'm not actually sure why this doesn't have a .venv folder, but if we go to another project that I have, you can see this. The .venv stands for the virtual environment, where Python is going to save a lot of different types of data, things related to the library and your scripts and other things. But most of the time we can just ignore this. The one thing we do not want to do is when we are working in our projects, we don't want to save anything in here. This is for something that the computer and the interpreter is going to be editing and adding to and adjusting, but we don't want to put our own files in there because they are not part of the virtual environment. But if we want to give this definition, this is where variables are saved temporarily when running a program in a development editor. So when we're writing these programs, we're kind of in this testing environment where we don't really want to allow ourselves to operate directly on our operating system's memory, because if we do something silly and we accidentally make an infinite number of variables, like we have something in a loop where we just keep making variables, which is possible in programming, we don't really want that to break our computer, and suddenly our computer is filled with a bunch of junk memory and then we have to clear it all, which can be very difficult to do. So for almost any development editor, like PyCharm here, we are almost always working in this kind of testing environment where we're not actually editing our memory directly. Now there are ways from this environment to save something to our memory or to access it, but we'll have to go through other packages to do that. In Python, there's a package called OS, which allows us to do this. OS stands for operating system, and the operating system of our computer is everything that is running the computer that you see. So an example is like Windows or Mac if we're talking about different popular computers. And this is everything that is controlling things like programs, program downloading, and running. These are controlling everything we see with the screen. Operations with the screen. Whenever we're saving things in memory. Operations involving saving in memory, and many other things. So we have two different environments that we're kind of potentially working in, but most of the time we're working in a virtual environment. So when we talk about variables, we actually have a lot of control over what we put in them and kind of like a nickname for this place in memory. So if we make a variable name, we'll use our name we've used before, container. EG stands for example given. And we store a number in it. What's happening here, I'll make some notes on this, is container has a memory address where the value 4 will be saved. And where it's saved, when we're running this editor, it's actually saved in the virtual environment. In the virtual environment memory. Now, if we look at what memory addresses really look like, they don't look very nice. So here's an example of a memory address, perhaps. A memory address might oftentimes look something like this, where we're going to get maybe some common starting symbol like an and sign, and then a whole bunch of random symbols, and that is the memory location. Now, it would not be very fun to have all of our variables be named like this because we don't really know what this means. And then if we're storing something in it, like 25, we're like, well, what does this represent, right? That's hard to understand what this represents. So instead of using these long memory addresses, things like container are the nicknames. We'll say that container is the nickname or label of the memory address where that number 4 is stored. So when we're naming variables, we want to name the variables according to the type of data that it is storing. So here's our instruction. We want to name variables according to the data that is being stored or how that data is going to be used. So container isn't a great variable name because it doesn't really say what the data represents, and it doesn't really say how we're using it. So how do you make a good variable name? Well, let's talk about that because there's going to actually be a lot of rules about how we should name variables. So there's going to be some rules that will give us errors if we don't follow them, and then there's going to be some rules that we should do because it's more conventional. So these are the variable naming rules, but also conventions. Well, maybe we'll add that right here. And conventions in Python. So we'll talk about which are rules and which are conventions, but we should follow all of these. Okay, first rule. Variable names cannot start with a number. Actually, no, let's start with something else. Variable names can only have letters, uppercase or lowercase, numbers, and either the underscore punctuation, which is the punctuation that we see on the key that's usually next to the 0 key. It's the longer flat line, and we have to press shift on the keyboard in order to get the underscore. If we don't press shift, we get this, which is a little bit shorter and a little bit higher up in the line, and that's a hyphen. So we don't want the hyphen, we want the underscore. The other thing that's technically allowed is this, the $sign. The $sign punctuation, what should we put for that? So just by what the rules say, we can only have letters, numbers, the underscore, or the punctuation, or the $sign symbol. So what does that mean? If we try to make a variable, let's make a variable like this. My favorite punctuation is the %sign. And we try to put something in it, we're going to see this red underline, which means we have an error. Cannot assign to operator. It's not the best hint for why this is an issue. But if we do look at this gray box here, we're going to see that it doesn't actually show a %sign because it thinks that's an operator. In class, we looked at this is the modulus operator when we use %sign. So we definitely can't use that. So because it doesn't think it can be in a variable name, it thinks we're trying to use this operator, and it gets confused. So this is not going to work. If we took it out, if we said the $sign, then it doesn't like something about this. That's interesting. I suppose it doesn't like us ending in a $sign. Would it do that? Oh, we're experimenting now. You know, I really thought the $sign was allowed. It might not be. Look at that. Well, let's take that out. We'll just say and the underscore punctuation. Okay, I think I was thinking of JavaScript. Sorry, mix them up. So only numbers, letters, and the underscore. Here we see that all here except the number. We can add a underscore and a number here, and that'll be fine. What else? We cannot begin a variable name with a number. If we try and do that, and assign it to a value, then we're going to get that little red underline, and it's confused. It thinks we're working with data, but we don't have data. We have a variable, so that's not going to work either. Okay, how else can we break our variable names? You'll notice that for this variable here, we separated our variable name by underscores. That is because a variable name cannot have any spaces, right? We kind of assume that spaces are related to letters, but in this case, we cannot use spaces. If we try and do the same thing here, we're going to get an error. It's going to be confused. So no spaces. Okay. Something you might also notice from time to time when we are coding is that if you look at the last line of your file, you might get this little yellow underline. Yellows are what we call warnings. They're not breaking your program, but maybe you're doing something that could result in an issue, or maybe something that's against standard formatting. In this case, if we hover above this, it says no new line into file. They want us to have one empty line with nothing in it at the end of our file. That's why they're giving us a yellow underline. Okay, what else? What else about variables can we have or not have? Well, there's actually not a lot of things else that are going to break our variable names, but there are a lot of conventions that we need to follow when naming things. So first convention. Our first convention is that we should not use any uppercase letters. If we make a variable with uppercase letters, it's going to allow us to do this. We're not getting any errors, but Python uses something called snake case. Snake case, what that is it's separating words in a variable name using underscores. And additionally, and all words are all lowercase. So kind of going with convention number 1, we got to have only lowercase letters. So my var here is not going to be conventional. We shouldn't use that. However, I might recommend using something like that. We'll talk about that later, though. There's a certain instance when we want to use something like that. Okay, what else? We need to have something called context. Need to have context. If I make a variable name like thing is equal to 5, I don't know how this variable is being used, and I don't know what kind of data it's holding. So if I see it later in my code, I might have remembered at one point that thing is supposed to represent the acceleration of an object on the screen, but later if I forget, then I have to go on a little a hunt trying to figure out what in the world this thing is supposed to be used for. It's like solving a puzzle, which takes time and efforts, and we don't really want to do that. So something like this is bad because there's no context. Because of that, we'll say 3a here. You don't want to use variable names that are a single letter or are too short. So if we say a is equal to 3, this is going to work. It's not breaking any rules, but the problem here is that we don't know what this is being used for. Same with thing. There's not enough details. So bad, no context. Don't use variables that are too short. You can also have a variable that's too short, like this. Maybe we have something that's trying to save the height of an image. And we say something like this: HOI is equal to 50. And maybe this is supposed to be 50 pixels for an image. But HOI, it really is an acronym. And if we forget what that acronym stands for, we're not going to know how to use that variable or what kind of data is it's holding. So this is bad. We don't want to use any acronyms because we're going to eventually forget it. If we have a program that's several hundred lines long or thousands of lines long or even longer, then we're going to start forgetting things and it's going to be difficult. So that kind of falls in that category as well. However, on the other hand, we don't want to use variable names that are too long. Really long variable names. The line that I use is, don't write a book for your variable names. So we could have a variable name like this, which is a bad idea. This variable name, or how about this variable holds data for figuring out the number of days until a person's birthday. That's a long variable name, very, very long, too long. We're essentially writing a whole complete sentence here. So when we are making variables, we actually want to use text speak. We want to take out those. Articles. We want to get rid of words. Maybe we shorten things. So that one's too long. If we wanted to make this shorter, it's a good exercise to figure out the best variable name for conciseness. Well, maybe we would say something like, if this is the number of days until a person's birthday, maybe we just don't talk about this part here. We don't need any of that. Maybe we shorten it to num days until birthday. There we go. That's a lot more concise, but we're still getting the main idea. We could probably even shorten this even more if we wanted to. Maybe we don't need the word num. Maybe it's just days until birthday. That's possible too. Now, we're eventually going to be using these variable names in expressions and multiplying them with other variables or have them in longer lines of code. So we don't want something really long, or else it's going to just fill up our whole screen and it's going to get difficult to see what's even going on. Like I can't even read this whole variable name on my screen, although this is a laptop, so the screen is a bit smaller than your computer. Okay, so what else? Do we have more? Yes. One convention, and this actually is going to vary depending on who you talk to, but one thing that I like to do, and that's common in a lot of languages, is that there is an instance where you do want to use uppercase letters. So we're kind of like going back on number one here. But if we have a variable whose value should not change, we call it a constant value. So any variable holding a constant value, something that should not change, use uppercase letters. So this is a way to differentiate variables whose values might change or might move around with variables that are holding some piece of data that we're going to use as a reference, like a reference point. So, and a good example of this is like something like pi, right? Pi, let's see, 3.141592653. Pi is going to have an infinite number of digits, but we should never have the value of pi be different, right? Pi is always 3.14. It's never supposed to grow or shrink, right? When we're using it in math class, it should always be this value. So we differentiate that by making it all uppercase. Another example, if we have like something that's multiple words, like how about total days in a year? This shouldn't change either, right? We always have 365 days in a year. So we can show that this is a variable that shouldn't change by using all uppercase separated by underscores. So that's just a convention. Not everyone does that, but it's a good idea to make your code more readable. What else can we do? What other conventions do we have? Let's see. There's one other thing. When we're using text speak, we really don't want to go overboard. Meaning we can make things like really short. Like if we take this variable my favorite punctuation, or how about num days until birthday? We could write this as num days until, I don't even know what to do for that. Maybe just take it out until birthday. For this, I don't know what that is. I'm going to know it for 1 second, and I'm going to return to this and be like, what does that stand for? Names, dying, bed. I don't know. You have to kind of guess. So this is like too much. We don't want to like make it so short that we have to like figure out what something stands for each time. What else? So kind of, we've mentioned this a few times, but we're going to add it to our list here. When we make a variable name, you want to, the name should describe the type of data and how it's being used, if possible. Or instead of and, let's say or. So if I have a variable like the power level of a computer, if I say power level, this isn't really good because I don't know what this is the power level of. So I need to describe not just the type of data, but maybe what it relates to, or it's how it's being used. So power level, computer power level would satisfy all of that. We know what it's talking about. We know it's being used for a computer. We're kind of getting a full context for this, which is good. Okay, any other conventions? Yes. We mentioned up here that we can use letters. We can use underscores. But we didn't mention if we should use those and in what order. So a few more things. First one is don't use numbers. It's kind of funny because we can use numbers, but we shouldn't. If you look in our variables here, except for this first one, we're not using any numbers here. And this is good. It can be a little confusing if you have numbers, particularly if you do something like this. If we have something like power, we have computer power level, and then we have computer power level 2. This is actually not good in terms of context. We don't know which computers we're talking about. I mean, unless they're named 1 and 2, then maybe, but we really want to avoid using numbers if possible. Just spell out the number if needed. And what we really don't want to do also is we don't want, like let's say we have something called index, which is often used. We don't want something like this, where we have a bunch of variables that are called index, and we're going to start getting confused which belong to each other, or which belong to what thing that we're using them for, or what they're being used for in the first place, or if they correspond with a particular collection or a function or whatever. So for all of these, we want to avoid using numbers in the variable name. We'll just copy paste all this. Copy, 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 copy. All right. One more. I believe there's just one more. Last thing is underscores are used in Python for a specific purpose when you start the variable with an underscore. And we'll look at this later when we're talking about objects. But generally speaking, variable names or function names that begin with an underscore mean that that variable is supposed to be private, unaccessible. Don't use this outside of a given scope. This one's a little hard to understand because we haven't talked about what scope is, we haven't talked about functions, we haven't talked about what this really means by private, but I just want to include it here since we're trying to do a comprehensive list. So if we had something like this, and we have something like collection reader, and we set it to, what do we set this to? How about we set it to a list? We can set it to an empty list. Never mind what this is used for, but the underscore means that this variable shouldn't be used outside of where you found it. Let's see, do I have examples of this? I think I do. If we go to the dictionary Python file, we'll use this this script in some of our later projects when working with words. So it's going to allow us to access dictionaries and do things like that. It's a pretty big file, but I know we have some underscores in here. There we go. We've got some functions that have some underscores. And this means that we don't really want this this method to be used just anywhere. It's being saved to use in a kind of closed context. I don't know if we have any variables in here that start with an underscore. It's possible. Let's see, are there any? No, I don't think so. So that might come up later, but I think that's our last conventional rule. All right, and we'll end our video there. In the next video, we're going to talk about how we assign values and how we can even take variables and assign them to other variables. So we'll begin talking about expressions.